Positive Support Community of Practice. Introduction to Minnesota's Positive Supports Rule. Minnesota Rule 9544, October 13, 2015.
All right, good morning and welcome. Welcome to our live stream broadcast. My name is Charles Young, and I'm the Positive Support Lead for the Disability Services Division of DHS. This interactive live stream broadcast is part of a series of broadcasts we call our Positive Support Community of Practice. For nearly 2 years, we have used this series to present on a number of topics to aid and support 245D providers, counties, and persons receiving services make the transition from previous regulations surrounding restrictive interventions to new standards under Minnesota Statutes 245D. 245D governs the service provision of home and community-based service providers. Today's session is the second of 2 sessions we have held covering the requirements of the newly effective Positive Supports Rule. The first was held on August 11th. The information we're covering today is nearly the same as the information provided on August 11th, with a couple of changes. There is a major change to how the department will apply the provisions of the rule, which we will cover towards the beginning of this session. We've also added more language directly from the rule into this presentation. Even though there's an informal rule about creating a PowerPoint that says every slide deserves a picture, but not every slide needs words, we're going to break that rule here today by giving you a lot of the language straight from the rule. This is actually something that our audience asked for at the session on August 11th. So while we did add more text, I do want to note up front that this presentation is not meant to provide you with every provision of the Positive Supports Rule. You're still encouraged to read the rule in its entirety and make yourself familiar with its provisions. This training will give you an overview of the provisions, however, so that you can leave here today with an understanding of how the rule may impact the services you are either a part of as a provider, a case manager, or a participant. So hopefully this isn't the first time that you've heard this, but it is possible. On August 11th, a new rule became effective which governs the service provision of 245D providers, as well as all DHS licensed providers serving a person with a developmental disability or related condition. This rule is codified as Minnesota Rule 9544 and informally called the Positive Supports Rule. In addition to 245D providers, the rule may govern the following facilities and services: family child care, family foster care, adult foster care, family adult day services, child care centers, adult daycare centers, children's residential facilities, the non-DOC programs, residential programs for adults with mental illness, the Minnesota Sex Offender Program, chemical dependency treatment detox services, and independent living assistance for youth. Here on this slide you can see an outline of the rule parts, which we are actually going to broadly cover during the session. Our agenda is noted here. Today I'll start by providing you with a brief history that led to the promulgation of the Positive Supports Rule. I understand many participants today are familiar with the history and even likely played a part in shaping the rule that we do have today. We also understand that we have many participants who may be learning about the rule for the first time, so this overview is really aimed at them. I'll then provide you with an overview of the rule, starting with the application, who's covered.
And then you can talk to them.
Oh, okay.
And if you want to mute it.
Sorry, looks like Blue Earth County, you've got your microphone on at the moment?
Oh.
Yep, we're here.
Just checking in.
If you could mute your line, that would be great. Thanks. So yes, we're going to cover a walkthrough of the provisions of the PSR and also touch on the forms required by the rule. We do intend to leave time for Q&A at the end. We have put together an FAQ within this PowerPoint that covers the main questions we've received over the last few weeks, so we may get to your questions even before the Q&A session. We do have a number of my colleagues here today from the Disability Services and the licensing divisions, though, for the Q&A portion when we get to that at the end. And so as far as questions go, we do have, you could be joining us in a number of ways. Of course, we do have our live sites where many of you are gathered watching via telepresence. Many of you, however, are probably participating via live stream and so don't have a direct link to us. Because of all the ways that you might be coming to us today, we are asking that all questions come in through our email. The email is on the screen here, positive supports, that's supports plural, @state.mn.us. By sending it to this email, we're able to track your question and make sure that we get to it either during the presentation today or afterwards if we don't have time. All right, so with that, we're going to jump in to a little bit of the history on where the positive support rule came from and how we got here. The creation of this rule was largely driven by the settlement of a class action lawsuit, commonly known as the Jensen Settlement Agreement. The lawsuit alleged the unlawful restraint of persons with developmental disabilities in a department-run residence for persons with disabilities, known as MEDO. As part of the settlement, which was reached in December of 2011, the department agreed to pursue a number of broad initiatives. Many of you are likely familiar with the Olmstead Plan, which was recently approved. The creation of that plan was one of the initiatives agreed to in the settlement agreement. Another one of those initiatives was to modernize the rules which previously governed restraint and seclusion, which were commonly known as Rule 40. The department agreed to convene a committee of stakeholders to provide recommendations on how to modernize Rule 40 based upon their understanding of best practice in the field. That group began meeting in January of 2012 and met through July of 2013. They were known as the Rule 40 Advisory Committee. Concurrent to their work, though, many of you are very keenly aware that the legislature adopted Minnesota Statutes Chapter 245D. That happened in 2012 to replace law previously governing home and community-based services. This was done to meet federal and local directives to create a single set of licensing standards for these services. A vast majority of the services that previously adhered to Rule 40 were now governed by 245D. 245D established prohibitions and limits on the use of aversive and deprivation procedures, timeout, chemical restraint, seclusion, mechanical restraint, and the programmatic use of manual restraint. It also required the use of positive support strategies. The provisions in 245D around these were added based upon anticipation of what the Rule 40 Advisory Committee were going to recommend to the department. But as you can see in this timeline, 245D was passed and amended before we received those final recommendations. Again, those recommendations came to us in July of 2013. Shortly after the Rule 40 Advisory Committee wrapped up their recommendations, DHS committed to fully implementing those recommendations. One of the main provisions in the committee's recommendations was that the department should apply their recommendations to all DHS licensed services, and that the recommendations be borne out through the creation of statute, rule, and a manual. 245D governed most services to persons with a developmental disability or related condition, but not all. So in 2014, the legislature agreed to expand the scope of the rule to all DHS licensed facilities and services serving a person with a developmental disability or related condition. The legislature also determined that the prohibitions from 245D and requirements surrounding the creation of positive support transition plans be applied to all DHS licensed facilities and services. So 245D went into effect in 2014, for those of you that are licensed under 245D. We have seen amendments to 245D in almost every session. We've seen amendments particularly to the definitions of seclusion and timeout in almost every session. And so later on in this presentation, as we cover each of the prohibited interventions, we're going to specifically call out those definitions so we understand what we're talking about with those techniques today. But the major rule writing effort launched then in the spring of 2014. We've seen a lot of public comment sessions since that time. The first of these started in September of 2014. Again, we had many participants at that time. We had 6 public input sessions. But the culmination of those public comment periods came in February of this year when we met before the administrative law judge. The judge, or ALJ, recommended that the rule be adopted in June of 2015. The governor agreed, and the rule was published in the State Register on August 17th. This obviously didn't leave much time for notice between official promulgation and the effective date of the rule, which was August 31st of this year. So, as we're meeting here today, the rule has been in effect for roughly a month and a half. Again, our first session was held on August 11th when we knew that the rule was going to be published in the State Register. Again, some of the information that we shared on August 11th has changed from that time, particularly when we talk about application of the rule. Go. So straight from the rule, we do want to cover the purpose, what the positive support rule was really meant to accomplish before we get into that application. This comes directly from the rule as it is written here today. The rule is meant to promote community participation, person-centeredness, and inclusion in the most integrated setting, It's meant to help people focus on creating quality environments, to ensure collaborative development of positive support strategies, to increase skills and self-determination of people receiving services, to improve the quality of life of people receiving services by ensuring people are free from humiliating and demeaning procedures, and eliminating the use of aversive and deprivation procedures. And ultimately, it is meant to create a consistent set of standards across service settings when dealing with positive support and restrictive interventions. And so a little recap of why we needed the positive supports rule. The rule does fulfill DHS's commitment to implementing the recommendations of the Rule 40 Advisory Committee by promulgating a rule governing the use of positive support strategies. And ultimately, the positive support rule complements Minnesota Statute 245D by expanding the applicability of prohibited procedures in settings and services provided to a person with a disability, and further expands on the positive supports required by a service provider. For 245D providers, the rule is meant to complement their current standards. For 245A providers, many of you tuning in, I believe, today, the rule applies portions of 245D to your services. We're going to call out many of those areas here today. So after the legislature was done providing the authority for the rule, this is what we were left with. A lot of language again here for you, but it gives the applicability of the rule. So again, the commissioner was meant to, or was supposed to, promulgate a rule by August 31st that would govern the use of positive support strategies and ensure the applicability of Chapter 245D prohibitions and limits on the emergency use of manual restraint, and on the use of restrictive interventions to facilities and services governed by the rules. Rules were to apply to all facilities and services licensed under Chapter 245D, as well as all licensed services and facilities serving a person with a developmental disability or related condition. There's been a lot of questions, I think, since we've begun with the promulgation of this rule, particularly about what developmental disability or related condition means. We do use a specific definition from another Minnesota rule, and again, commonly known as Rule 185. And we're going to cover that definition here for you today, so again, that you can understand if you're a 245A provider, again, not a 245D provider. If you're a 245A provider, you can understand who the rule applies to. But basically, here is the rundown. Where does the positive supports rule apply? For home and community-based waiver services and anything licensed under 245D, the rule applies to any person receiving a 245D licensed service. So that is regardless of disability status or which waiver they happen to be on. For all other department licensed services, those licensed under 245A, not 245D, the positive supports rule applies to persons with a developmental disability or related condition. And again, we are using that definition from Rule 185 to cover who it qualifies as a person with a developmental disability or related condition. And this is the most text that we have on one slide, again, but we wanted to get it here for you. So again, you'd understand what developmental disability or related condition means. And it was hard to split it up, unfortunately. So we do think that most people will fall under the persons with a related condition for the purposes of this rule. It does mean that someone has been diagnosed under this part as having a severe chronic disability that meets all of the following conditions in 1 through 4 here. 1, it has to be attributable to cerebral palsy, epilepsy, autism, Prader-Willi, or any other condition other than mental illness as defined under Minnesota Statutes 245, or an emotional disturbance as defined under Minnesota Statutes 245 as well, found to be closely related to a developmental disability because the condition results in impairment of general intellectual functioning or adaptive behavior similar to that of persons with a developmental disability, and requires treatment or services similar to those required for persons with developmental disability. And so here are the other conditions. It does have to be, the condition has to be manifested before the person reaches 22 years of age, is likely to continue indefinitely, and importantly, results in a substantial functional limitations in 3 or more of the following areas of major life activity. And I hope you can read it here on your screen. I see that's a little blurred on our big screen here as well. Those 6 areas are self-care, understanding and use of language, learning, mobility, self-direction, or capacity for independent living. And again, if you're not able to see that, you can find that definition directly in Minnesota Rule 9525.0016 surrounding case management administration. The next definition is that of a person with a developmental disability. That means a person who has been diagnosed as having substantial limitations in present functioning, manifested as significantly sub-average intellectual functioning, existing concurrently with demonstrated deficits in adaptive behavior, and who manifests these conditions before the person's 22nd birthday. So on August 11th, when we were talking about the applicability of the rule, we did state that someone would really need to have a Rule 185 assessment for us to know that they would qualify under this definition. We do want to now expand that to state that someone doesn't necessarily have to have a Rule 185 assessment. They just need to meet these diagnostic criteria. So if someone does happen to have a Rule 185 assessment and has been deemed eligible for DD case management services, it is definitely going to be determined that they fall underneath the provisions of this rule. Again, if you're also receiving a 245D license service, it's also guaranteed that you'll fall under the provisions of this rule. For all other services, each of our licensing areas are coming out with some instructional documents to help you identify others that might meet these criteria and how you might note whether or not they meet the criteria. So similar to August 11th, we have a couple of frequently asked questions in the area of applicability that we want to cover here today. One of the main questions we've received is from 245D providers. In this example, a person works with individuals with a brain injury and wondering if the rule is applicable to their clients. The answer is yes, that the rule does apply to all persons receiving a 245D license service. Again, that's regardless of disability status. The next is for a daycare provider working with a child whom they think might have a developmental disability, wondering if the rule would be applicable to that person. The answer would be only if they've been informed that the child meets the diagnostic criteria as having a developmental disability or related condition. The same really goes for another type of setting, the children's residential facilities. Even though they're not licensed under 245D, if they serve someone with autism, wondering if this rule would be applicable to that person. The answer is the same, only if they've been informed that the client meets diagnostic criteria as having a developmental disability-related condition. So the thing that we want to note is it's not just having the diagnosis of autism that means that a person qualifies under developmental disability-related condition. All the other conditions in 9525.0016 need to be met then as well. All right, so now that we have covered the applicability of the rule, we are going to do a walkthrough of the positive support rule requirements. We're going to go mostly in order that you see it if you're going to read the rule then as well. Here we see a summary of the major provisions. The major provisions of the rule include the need to develop and document positive support strategies for every person. Again, that's regardless of whether or not interfering or target behavior exists. The need to maintain a policy on the emergency use of manual restraint and notify everyone that you serve about that policy. There are prohibitions on the use of restrictive interventions. There are provisions that do require functional behavior assessments in some instances. There are requirements for the development of a plan known as the Positive Support Transition Plan, PSTP, which again we'll cover here today. Right after applicability, our number one question surrounding the rule has to do with staff qualifications and training, and we will spend some time there covering many of the frequently asked questions that we've received surrounding qualifications and training. And everyone does need to report using an electronic form known as the Behavior Intervention Report Form, or BIRF. And again, we're going to cover all of that here today as well. So looking first at positive support strategies and person-centered planning. There is a requirement, and again, this comes straight from the rule, that all license holders must use positive support strategies in providing services to a person. These positive support strategies must be incorporated in writing to an existing treatment, service, or other individual plan required of the license holder. And surrounding that, there is a requirement that at least every 6 months, a license holder is to evaluate with the person whether the strategies meet the standards in this rule and determine whether changes are needed to positive support strategies. So again, one of our frequently asked questions around this area is whether or not positive support strategies are required for everyone or just those that require a positive support transition plan. You can see here in the first line, positive support strategies are required for everyone. And just to be clear about what we mean by positive support strategy, because I'm sure there are a lot of differing definitions out there. The rule is specific that a positive support strategy means a strengths-based strategy based on an individualized assessment that emphasizes teaching a person productive and self-determined skills or alternative strategies and behaviors without the use of restrictive interventions. There's more in the rule surrounding what a positive support strategy is. Again, they have to be incorporated into an existing treatment, service, or other individualized plan. And to develop and implement positive support strategies, those strategies must be selected that are evidence-based, person-centered, ethical, integrate a person into their chosen community, are the least restrictive to the person, and are effective. And one of the things that we wanted to make clear is that the definition in the rule is quite broad. It was meant to be able to encapsulate a number of approaches that might be working out there. I think one of the main confusions around this area as we were going through the promulgation process was whether or not when we were talking about positive support, if we were talking specifically about positive behavior support. And I think that confusion really kind of rose because the Rule 40 Advisory Committee recommended that the DHS adopt positive behavior support. But as we went through the promulgation process of the rule, we heard from many members of the community from areas that weren't specific to developmental disabilities. And those areas and those advocates wanted to make sure that we included all of the other approaches out there that might qualify as positive approaches. And so here you can see examples of those other types of approaches that might qualify under this definition. Of course, we have positive behavior support here, but then we have some other commonly used modalities such as CBT, DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, person-centered thinking and planning, systems of care, wraparound planning, trauma-informed practices, multi-systemic therapy, response to intervention, and motivational interviewing. And there are others as well. These are just examples. So again, positive support strategies must be developed for every person. There's also a requirement in the rule that providers must incorporate principles of person-centeredness into their services. Person-centered planning and person-centered thinking is something that I think the department and the community has been talking about for decades. For the first time, though, in Minnesota, we do have a specific definition of what person-centered planning is, and that's located here in the rule. You can see the definition here that person-centered planning means a strategy used to facilitate team-based plans for improving a person's quality of life, as defined by the person's family, and other members of the community. And that focuses on the person's preferences, talents, dreams, and goals. Person-centered planning is a part of a family of approaches to organizing and guiding community change in alliance with people with disabilities and their families and friends. Specifically, the positive support rule requires that person-centered planning must include life planning with the person placed at the center of the planning process and the person's preferences and choices reflected in the selection of services and supports. It must involve the person directly with the person's community, network of connections, and close personal relationships that build on the person's capacity to engage in activities and promote community life, as well as identify goals to support the person in the most integrated setting. In addition to person-centered planning, the rule requires license holders to incorporate principles of person-centeredness in services it provides to a person that reflect the person's strengths, preferences, daily needs and activities, and accomplishment of their goals. And similar to the evaluation of positive support strategies, every 6 months, license holders must evaluate with the person whether services support the person's preferences, needs, and activities. We don't have it in our FAQ here, but one of the most frequent questions we have in this area that have come in recently is about whether or not those evaluations have to happen in person, how these things have to happen, whether or not the team is involved. Again, going with person-centered planning, if the person wants other people to be there, that would be up to them. And the evaluation, there is nothing in the rule at this point that says what medium that this evaluation has to occur, just that it is done with the person. So we know we, again, have a lot of services out there, and depending on how you more frequently interact with the person that you're working with, you have the option of meeting in a number of different ways. We're skipping ahead in the rule, but we did want to call this out right now that there is an exemption from documenting positive support strategies for 3 services. Exempt from the documentation is family child care, family foster care, and family adult day. This exemption only covers the documentation requirements. These services are not exempt from having to report using the behavior intervention report form, maintaining that policy on emergency use of manual restraint, and the need to develop positive support transition plans. So again, this is just an exemption from general documentation. So those are the requirements around positive support strategies and person-centered planning. One of the, I think, more confusing areas of the rule, too, has to do with our definition of restrictive intervention, particularly for 245D providers who are kind of used to the terms restricted and prohibited. Restrictive interventions is defined here as any procedure that is prohibited by 245D, as well as any procedure that's prohibited by this rule. There are specific prohibitions in this rule. It also means that when we talk about restrictive interventions, the emergency use of manual restraint. And this is another one of those confusing areas where some people read to see that manual restraint is prohibited under 245D. And so the assumption is that emergency use of manual restraint would be prohibited then as well. Manual restraint and emergency use of manual restraint are defined separately and then treated separately in 245D. One is prohibited, the other is restricted. And we're going to get into that a little bit more, so hopefully we can clarify this area. So when we talk about those interventions that are prohibited by 245D and then included in 9544 by reference, these are those prohibited interventions. Chemical restraint, mechanical restraint, manual restraint. And we've got a note here that that's programmatic. We'll talk about that when we get to the definition. Timeout, seclusion, and aversive and deprivation procedures. We're going to hit each of these definitions specifically, so again that you understand what we're talking about with each of these procedures. The first is chemical restraint. It's defined in 245D as the administration of a drug or medication to control the person's behavior or restrict the person's freedom of movement, and is not a standard treatment or dosage for the person's medical or psychological condition. I'm going to jump ahead of myself. One of our main questions around this area has to do with the use of psychotropic PRNs and whether or not they automatically constitute the use of chemical restraint. The answer is no, they don't automatically constitute the use of chemical restraint, but it is possible if they meet this definition. During the legislative sessions where these definitions were developed and ultimately brought forward, probably the most common example of chemical restraint that we ran into was the use of Benadryl to put someone to sleep, rather than using it as it's directed for someone's allergies. The next definition is that of manual restraint. It's defined in 245D as physical intervention intended to hold a person immobile or limit a person's voluntary movement by using body contact as the only source of physical restraint. So again, on its surface, it would appear that manual restraint in general is prohibited. But the emergency use of manual restraint, which again we'll cover in a little bit here, is a restricted procedure, which means that it can be used in certain circumstances. The next definition in 245D is of mechanical restraint. This is our longest definition in 245D, and I apologize, but I will read it to you here. Mechanical restraint is defined as the use of devices, materials, or equipment attached or adjacent to the person's body, or the use of practices that are intended to restrict freedom of movement or normal access to one's body or body parts, or limits a person's voluntary movement, or holds a person immobile as an intervention precipitated by a person's behavior. The term applies to the use of mechanical restraint used to prevent injury with persons who engage in self-injurious behaviors, such as headbanging, gouging, or other actions resulting in tissue damage that have caused or could cause medical problems resulting from self-injury. It is clarified in the definition that mechanical restraint does not include devices worn by the person that trigger electronic alarms to warn staff that a person is leaving a room or area, which do not in and of themselves restrict freedom of movement, or the use of adaptive aids or equipment or orthotic devices ordered by a healthcare professional used to treat or manage a medical condition. That is mechanical restraint.